Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Danny Yanez, and I am honored to serve as the new Executive Director of Seraphic Fire. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this special lecture on our upcoming concert, Renaissance Capilla Flamenca. Tonight, we're joined by Seraphic Fire's Artistic Director and co-founder, Patrick Dupre Quigley, esteemed musicologist, Honey Meconi, and our upcoming concert's guest conductor, Amanda Quist. Before we get started, just a quick housekeeping note. Please keep yourself muted during the session to ensure everyone can enjoy the presentation without interruptions. We'll have time for questions at the end of the lecture. I'm also excited to share that tonight's lecture is being recorded and will be available on YouTube. It will also be featured on our Seraphic Saturday podcast, so if you enjoyed the discussion, feel free to share it with friends or revisit it later. Thank you again for being here. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to Patrick Quigley to begin the lecture.
Thank you very much, Danny. It's so nice to be here. Happy New Year to everyone. I hope that you are making it through this chilly South Florida weather. For the rest of the country, I think everyone is quite envious right now. And really want to welcome you for being here and thank you for coming tonight. As Danny said, if you have never been to a Seraphic Fire program before, my name is Patrick Quigley. I'm the Artistic Director of Seraphic Fire. And this online lecture is actually the third in a series of 6 that we are hosting during our 22nd season, titled Music History 101. Seraphic Fire's next program, the Capilla Flamenca, an exploration of music of the Renaissance, runs from January 16th through 19th in venues across South Florida. In this concert, we'll be exploring the history and music behind one of the greatest choirs of all time, Spain's Capilla Flamenca. The Capilla, which resided in Spain for most of the 16th century and continued on through a portion of the 17th century, was known both for the prestige of its composers and chapel masters, as well as the virtuosity of its performers. Tonight, to explore the musical and political history surrounding this incredible ensemble, I am joined by 2 very special guests. My first guest and Seraphic Fire's collaborating scholar is Honey Meconi. Professor Honey Meconi is the inaugural Arthur Satz Professor at the University of Rochester, where she is also Professor of Musicology at the Eastman School of Music. She's the founding editor of the monograph series Oxford Studies in Early Music for Oxford University Press. She is a specialist in music before 1600, and her many publications include Hildegard of Bingen, the first English language book on Hildegard as a composer, Pierre de la Rue and Musical Life at the Habsburg Burgundian Court, and a continually expanding series of a performing edition of Hildegard's music freely available online. A lifelong performer, she is co-recipient of the American Musicological Society's Noah Greenberg Award for distinguished contribution to the study and performance of early music. Her public musicology blog, The Choral Singer's Companion, Music History with a Soupçon of Snark, is read worldwide, and I encourage you to search that out. Honey, welcome back to Seraphic Fire.
Patrick, it's wonderful to be here. As you know, I adore Seraphic Fire. You guys are absolutely amazing, wonderful programs, and I'm delighted to be here.
Great. And I also hope that you are keeping warm in Rochester right now. Also joining us for this online lecture is Dr. Amanda Quist, the guest conductor for our program. Dr. Quist is a professor at the Western Michigan University's Irving S. Gilmore School of Music, where she serves as director of choral activities. Dr. Quist has collaborated in choral preparations with the Philadelphia Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, New World Symphony, Palm Beach Symphony, Dresden Staatskapelle, and the Spoleto Festival. Her early music ensemble, Westminster Cantorai, won first place in the 2018 American Prize for Choral Performance. Quist's other honors include the James Mulholland National Choral Award and the Audrey Davidson Early Music Award. Dr. Quist frequently serves as a guest conductor and lecturer across the US and abroad. Her research is published in the Choral Journal, Lexington Books. Her choral compositions are published by Walton Music and GIA, and she serves as the editor for 2 choral series with Walton Music and Gentry Publications. Prior to joining the faculty at Western Michigan University, Dr. Quist served for many years as the director of choral studies for the University of Miami's Frost School of Music. There, in addition to conducting the university's choral ensembles and teaching conducting graduate students, she established the Seraphic Fire Scholars Program. Through the Seraphic Fire Scholars, 12 vocalists and 2 graduate conductors perform annually with Seraphic Fire. Amanda, welcome back to Seraphic Fire.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to come back and make music with everyone. And what a perfect choir to sing this music. You know, as you describe them, I think, yes, this is exactly the right thing and the right moment. So very excited.
Thank you, Amanda. So I have a number of questions for our experts this evening. And at the end of tonight's presentation, we will also invite questions from you, our audience. If you think of a question during the program, please feel free to put it in the chat and I will pass it along to our guest scholars. Now, without further ado, let's move on to discovering more about the legendary Capilla Flamenca. So to begin, I'll start with a question to Honey. So Honey, can we set the stage for this amazing choir with a question about the royal family who established and nurtured the ensemble? So what is the significance of the Habsburg family and who was Charles V? This is like, it's like Jeopardy, except I'm actually asking you a question. So go for it, Honey.
So Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor in the first part of the 16th century. And he came from an illustrious family on both sides, both his father's side and his mother's side. And he, by the time he came of age, he was ruler of more territory than anyone basically since the Roman Empire. And he established, well, let me step back a minute, and he loved music. This is the important thing for us. He loved music. On his father's side, he was descended from the Habsburg family, which ruled Hungary, Austria, big chunks of Germany, and pretty much all of the Low Countries. On his mother's side, he was the grandson of Ferdinand, the King of Spain, the Ferdinand and Isabella. Between his 2 grandparents, his 2 grandfathers, and Charles, all of the male people who could have been heirs died at a young age. So he became the ruler. He inherited all of this territory when he was still a teenager, basically. And that set the foundation for the amount of power and money he had at his disposal. Because remember, at this time, it's the early 16th century, Spain has already pretty much conquered most of South America and a good chunk of North America as well. And they're pulling in all those gold and riches and using it for their battles and wars and things like that, but also for the arts.
So Amanda, you've been working with this music for quite some time, and there are some other characters sort of involved with this as well. And who are those folks? I mean, they're not necessarily the primary rulers of some folks got sort of pushed to the side in all of this.
Yeah, as I was researching kind of the timeline, you know, Charles' father, I think, died when he was about 6 years old. And his mother, of course, was Juana, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. So she became an heiress to Castile and Aragon. But it was quickly pointed out that she was maybe not fit. And she was, you know, some scholars say manipulated made to look crazy, because there was a great interest in her not taking power in any of these things and to push her aside. So I thought that was really interesting because it's one of those moments in history where you wonder, gosh, if this was today, how would this have been different, and how might she have been treated, and so forth. So she was an interesting figure to me to think about. And then the other person was Margaret, who was sort of a caretaker for Charles, I guess, when he was young. His parents passed or were deemed unfit when he was very, very young, and so he had this sort of help from Margaret of Austria, who apparently was a brilliant musician and scholar and so forth, and had her own set of collections of pieces. And so just interesting to note her influence on Charles was most certainly a part of his musical development as a young person.
I'm glad that Amanda brought up both Juana and Margaret, because they were both actually important figures. Juana actually loved music. Everyone loved music in these families, but Juana loved music. After her husband died, he died at a young age. He was 28 years old, and rumors of poisoning started right from the beginning because they thought Ferdinand probably wanted to get rid of him. After her husband died, she traveled around Spain with his decomposing body in a coffin, and was, in theory, in charge of all of his musicians and his courtiers and all that. The only people who got paid during this time were the musicians. So she really did love music. Margaret was Charles's aunt, and Charles had been left behind. Charles's father and mother were in Spain when his father died. Charles had been left behind in the Low Countries. Margaret, his aunt, became his guardian, basically, and brought him up to have a music tutor and to hear wonderful music all the time. So she was indeed a very, very important person for his musical upbringing.
This family seems a little bit like a evening soap opera, sort of Dynasty or Dallas. We've got a little bit of everything going on. So, honey, Capilla Flamenca translates into Flemish chapel. So how does a musical ensemble from Flanders end up in the court of Spain? Because it's sort of gone back and forth a bit during the 16th century as well.
So Charles he's born in the Low Countries. He's raised in the Low Countries. His father dies when he's 6. His grandfather dies when he's 16. And the following year, he decides he better go visit Spain for the first time and let people know who's in charge. He's only 17 years old, but he's actually the one in charge. So he takes with him his own chapel from the north, and that is the Capilla Flamenca. And so that's where this group comes from. He always has both a Capilla Flamenca and a Spanish chapel. The Flemish chapel had, I'm trying to think of a way to put this, somewhat more experience with music, and was typically a bigger chapel. That was always his default chapel, and that was the chapel he took with him when he went all around Europe, which he was constantly doing because he's the ruler of Spain, but he's also the ruler of Austria, parts of Hungary, parts of Germany, the Low Countries. Those are the ones who always travel with him. So that's where the name comes from. They are predominantly Flemish singers. They originated in Flanders, and they are his, in a sense, home chapel, as it were. But there is always a Spanish chapel in residence in Spain. So that's where that comes from.
So for some of our, when we talk about chapel, we're talking not only about the people who are singing in this group or composing for it, but I think, Connie, could you explain what it's sort of also everyone who sets up for Mass, the priests who are involved with Mass, the rectors of, so that he didn't have to change either musicians or clerics when he traveled. I mean, he had a big entourage, is what you're saying, for music and for liturgical matters.
Had a massive entourage for absolutely everything. We have the pay list, they're cooks, they're archers, I mean, you name it, they are there. And you're absolutely right. These aren't just singers. These are the priests who are singing the mass. There's someone who's always carrying the organ. There are all sorts of people involved. But the chapel is unusual in being so large. Sometimes it was as many as 36, 40 different people, which back then was absolutely massive. A normal church might have 3 or 4 people who could sing. This is huge for the 16th century. And that was one of the things that was so special about it. When he went touring from place to place, suddenly he'd drag out this massive chapel who would sing mass for him every day and everyone who was going to be there. So it was really in a lot of ways showing off. Look how many singers I have working for me.
And they had the Capilla Flamenca had a reputation as sort of an all-star ensemble, rivaling similar establishments at the Sistine Chapel in Rome or the Julian Chapel in Rome, which was the choir of St. Peter's, and maybe even St. Mark's in Venice, or perhaps the fame of the Pietà in Venice when Vivaldi was there. What was so special about this group that they had a sort of a storied background? What was the special sauce for the Capilla Flamenca?
Well, they had been around longer. I mean, the predecessors to the Capilla Flamenca had been around since the 14th century. So there's a very, very, very long tradition of important chapels, important singers connected with the Habsburg Burgundian court. So that was one component of it. They are also not just singing sacred music, they're also singing secular music, whereas the other groups are predominantly, in fact, exclusively performing sacred music. They are also itinerant. They're always following wherever the ruler is. And Charles was constantly on the road. So people got to see them. One thing that's very interesting about the 16th century is that choirs were one way that different rulers tried to one-up each other. They wanted to show their choir was a bigger, fancier choir doing harder music or something like that. I actually love the idea that music, especially choral music, is where you put your money and where you show off and where you want to show exactly how wonderful you are. I would secretly love it if we had more of that today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something to be said about tradition and sort of musical ensembles that, I don't know what you think about this, Amanda, but I certainly know that, every year that Seraphic Fire has been around is another year of experience amidst the rank of tradition, of ways that we do things, which means that there's something that we don't have to talk about how this is performed. We can just rely on tradition. I think that's probably your experience both at the collegiate and at the professional level.
Absolutely. Once you've kind of started a culture and an expectation, it just can spin upon itself. And sometimes it's so great that the other members will just kind of, let the new ones know, hey, this is kind of how this goes. And it can become a really brilliant thing and cause the development of the level of the ensemble to rise and rise and rise, so that you're not constantly starting over. And I can imagine with the kind of resources and the number of years that this group existed, I mean, I can't even imagine something like this today, following the president around or something. It's absolutely incredible. And yes, the tradition just stands on itself and then just continues to sort of evolve. It's very exciting.
Yeah. So, honey, here at Seraphic Fire, we have performed many works by Spanish composers of the same period of the Capilla Flamenca. So, Francisco Guerrero, Cristobal Morales, Sebastián Vivanco, Tomás Luis de Vitoria, Peñalosa, Ortiz. These are part of a magnificent musical tradition, but I don't think any of them were members of the Capilla Flamenca. And yet this is like the Spanish, the primary musical ensemble of the state for Spain. Why are none of these names also on the list of names for the Capilla Flamenca?
That's a great question. And it's they haven't left us letters or diaries or things that would help us answering that question. But we can look at their careers, and most of them either worked for cathedrals in Spain or sometimes the papal chapel or both. And what I can imagine is that they were content to be in a situation where they didn't have to be traveling all the time. So that's sort of my guess behind why they did not become members of the choir. I do know that the choir would frequently go to the Low Countries to search for singers. And partly that's because there's an incredible musical training tradition in the Low Countries that was a source for many, many professional singers of the time. In fact, Italian chapels of the 16th century are filled with musicians from the North. So I think that may be those two things, looking to the North for performers and possibly a desire on the part of Spanish composers not to be constantly traveling. But I will say we know from the inventories of music that Charles had and his successors had and his predecessors had, they're performing all these Spanish composers as well. They love this music. They form an important part of their repertoire. They just didn't work for the Capilla Flamenca, but they love their music.
That's good to know that there was, and probably there were issues of language. If it's the Flemish chapel, are they necessarily even rehearsing in the language of rehearsal? One wonders what they're talking to each other as they rehearse this music. So, Amanda, all of the music that we're performing is from a period between roughly 1400 and 1600, which coincides with the European Renaissance. What distinguishes the music of the Renaissance from what came before and after? And specifically, what does that mean in the realm of vocal music?
Yeah, I think the Renaissance is probably, to me, the most exciting period because it is the most vocal, if that makes sense. The music is just all about the singer. So if you think about the medieval period, certainly there was singing happening, and we had, isorhythm, vocal parts of diverse rhythmic textures, multiple texts. We might have more than one language in a singular piece of music. But we move into the Renaissance period, and the music is more characterized by single texts, more standardized vocal scorings, typically between 4 and 8 parts, although we know, if you start to go to England and you look at Thomas Tallis, we get to 40 parts. So of course it expands all over the place. But the polyphony is more kind of horizontally conceived. And I think one of the most interesting things is the development of polyphony and equal voiced polyphony, which puts a pressure or at least an opportunity on every single vocal line to have something interesting to do. You're almost never in the background. So that's a major part, I think, of the difference of these things. And then, of course, when we move past the Renaissance, we start to lose some of the richness of polyphony in some ways as we kind of make an effort to hear more clarity of text, or we're dealing with some monody in the Baroque period and so forth. So it really is kind of, as we say, the golden age of the Renaissance is in some ways the golden age of choral music, I think, at least in my opinion, for the singer.
And when you talk about polyphony, and I think most of us hear it and have a general idea about what that means, but a piece like the Hallelujah Chorus is not polyphonic. It's everyone, especially at the beginning, is everyone singing the same words in the same rhythm at the same time. What is vocal polyphony?
I think it's a great question. I think the simplest way to think of it is, well, when we learn as children, how to sing with others, we might learn rounds and canons, right? And so we learn, okay, I'll sing my melody and then you sing yours starting a few beats later, and then you sing yours. So very basic forms of polyphony. So they would use what we might call a point of imitation. So a melodic start, and then another line will have the same point of imitation, either at the same pitch level or maybe a fourth or a fifth away. and they kind of, float around together, come together. They may have a cadence, something else may join. And the way that that happens over time changes depending on who's writing and when we're looking at the music. Even the music of Josquin changes hugely throughout his life in that way.
Uh, so, and while so we're talking about Renaissance music, and in a large sense, like Renaissance music, it's probably familiar to Seraphic Fire audiences, but this particular repertoire that we are seeing has more of a niche following. It's less recorded, it's less performed. There are many reasons for that, but what, in your opinion, are some of those?
Yeah, so when I first was looking at this body, first of all, this group of people, these composers, it was not so easy to find what we would call modern editions, or if modern editions exist, they're hard to get your hands on. So you have to talk with people like Honey and say, "Hey, do you have an edition of this, or could we get permission to take this one motet out of this collection," and so forth. So it's just not as easy to access to start. And there's reasons why that could be. I think one is like the music of Craquignon, who was, we think, the chapelmeister potentially for a period of time, but certainly a lot of his music is in these collections. And he took the place of Gombert, which is another interesting story that maybe Honey can elaborate on. But anyway, or maybe not. But anyway, so Craquignon kind of came in and saved everything, I suppose, in a way. And he has a bunch of motets, especially. But I found this one parody mass, the Missa Domine Deus. And so the Domine Deus was a motet that was written, and then he wrote a mass with the same kind of polyphonic fabric around it. But this is something that you wouldn't necessarily find so easily if you were just Googling it and looking for it on Pepper or something, where people typically will look for choral pieces. I was lucky to find an edition of this by Gareth Thomas, who has done some of the music of Craquignon, has set them, made them available to us. But a lot of this music may have been buried for some time. Maybe it was performed quite a bit during the lifetime of these folks, and then it was maybe stored in collections and just not seen as often. Certainly not the case with people like Josquin, but I think some of them, what we might consider today more obscure names of composers in the program, it's just harder to come by. Then you need to find choirs who can actually sing it. And part of that requires some transposition and some thoughtfulness about the modern choir that has sopranos and altos in it that are women, as opposed to just all lower voices. One of the things I found most interesting is some of the music of Pierre de la Rue in its original key, which of course is nebulous because we don't know for sure what that was, but we think maybe he had access to several very low basses because his bass parts sit very low, and it's interesting to just imagine, who these kind of rock star singers were at the time and what they were capable of. So I think that's part of the reason why it's a little hard to come by and to find recordings of. I think I found one recording of this particular mass, or maybe there are two, but that's it. As opposed to like Josquin's Ave Maria, where there are 100 recordings of it, because there are so many editions and it's been so often performed.
And Honey, you've had actually a specialization in Pierre de la Rue, whose music is found in the Flemish chapel, and both like Leroux, Gombert, who we mentioned, Craquillon. This is pretty dense music. This is not Vivaldi. This is Strauss. I mean, we're really sort of, if we think about the medieval period as sort of a classical, a big C classical period, the Renaissance is definitely sort of a romantic analog. Clearly they must have had amazing people to perform this, because they didn't even have a full score. They were reading from single lines, probably sharing a book. I mean, is this, tell us a little bit about like how we possibly have the training and the voices to even perform it at the time when now, we're challenged to be able to sing this music.
Well, one of the amazing things about the Renaissance is that people start singing at a very, very, very young age. You start singing as a choir boy, so you are 5 or 6 or 7 or something like that. Voices change much later than in general because people, for the most part, seem to hit puberty later. So they have a long experience of singing on a regular basis this sort of music, so they're being trained at a very, very, very early age. And I think all of us who are in the music world know the younger you can get someone to start singing or playing an instrument or something like that, just the easier it is for them to develop as a musician. So that's one part of it. Going back to something that Amanda said a little bit earlier, they're working with one tradition. These days, a singer is learning classical music, and within classical music, there's romantic and Baroque and so on and so forth, but they're probably also singing some musical theater, whatever. There's one style that people are learning at this time. So that enables them, that helps them very much to be excellent sight readers and to be able to hold their own when there are other parts going on. I want to add one more thing to what Amanda was saying about why this music can be challenging to perform today. When we have modern editions, some of these are actually quite old, going back to the 19th or early 20th century, and people for the most part, transcribing then, because notation was different in the Renaissance, when they transcribe it into modern notation, they are often using old clefs. They're not using treble clef or bass clef. They're using soprano clef, mezzo soprano clef, alto clef, tenor clef, which one can learn how to read. It's certainly not impossible, but your average singer today doesn't spend time learning anything other than the treble clef or the bass clef. So that's one thing that has, I think, held back a little from some of these pieces being performed and recorded.
Yeah, I remember when we first started performing the music of Gomber. It was only available, and this is like 2003. So not terribly long ago, especially like in relation to when this music was written, that we could only find pieces that were written in clefs. And so a lot of our rehearsal period was spent like, oh, no, oh gosh, no, C is actually on this line. And for our audience, instrumentalists will read in clefs from time to time. So the viola part is in alto clef, usually, where middle C is the center line of the staff. Or sometimes cello or trombone parts will be in tenor clef, which just means that more of the music stays on the staff. And you don't have to waste ink putting ledger lines above. Now that we just print music, we don't need the clefs nearly as much because ink is not necessarily a commodity. Although I would say that it's rapid fire, maybe 75% of the people who are singing in our group sing from an iPad. So ink doesn't even matter. I imagine, I imagine that you all are both in university situations that you're probably dealing with people who are only who look at a paper score and think, oh, how passe, this is like sort of a crazy thing. And it really is. Let's talk a little bit more about this, Amanda, if you could. And so, as you mentioned some of the challenges, and as you said, there were low basses, very low basses, but this was an all-male ensemble, and the trebles were probably not as high as we think of the soprano lines of today, and so you're having to move things around. What are some of the challenges in translating this music into a modern contemporary professional choir like Seraphic Fire, which has women as sopranos and altos, and basses and tenors who are singing normal contemporary bass lines, which don't always go down to the C below the staff. Talk to us about, you're programming this. You're basically taking one ensemble and placing it upon a completely different set of voices. What are some of the things you went through putting together this program to get to this point?
Yeah, so I'll start with the Craquillon, which I decided to use as a framework for the entire program. And so we're going to do almost all of the movements of the mass. But the first thing I did, and Honey and I chatted about this a bit, was after looking at the score, we asked it to be bumped up a whole step. For a couple of reasons. And it's really interesting and tricky when you think of a singer's passaggio, which is the break in their voice. There's usually two. And if a piece sits in a certain place for a singer, it can be extremely fatiguing. So if it's too low, especially for sopranos, they just can't sustain it. And that's one of the things that was a consideration for me, is choosing a program that we could actually sing all of it, because it's relentless. There are very few cadence points. There's very few places to hide or rest. You just are always a part of the line. So that's one of the things. So by bumping the key up a little bit, that lets the sopranos, for example, have a little bit better place of comfort with where those breaks lie. The tricky part always is the alto and tenor parts, because the alto tenor parts sit either high or low for one or the other. So we have to do some borrowing and some jumping up and some jumping down to sort of cover those. And I think, we've got some of that taken care of in the way that that you've staffed this choir, but some of that will just have to happen in rehearsal as well, where we'll have conversations about, ooh, that pitch is just not something I can sing. I need you to jump up and grab it for me. So, it's navigating all of that. And then the bass parts are not terribly low once we've popped it up. So, some of the basses in this particular choir with Seraphic can sing. I mean, they can anchor a Russian, a Vespers.
Eric Alatorre, I think, is singing, right?
Yes, exactly. But we won't get to hear much of that, unfortunately, unless we just ask him to drop the octave occasionally just for fun. But, it's really not intended to be so expansive in that way. So the music is just a little bit more compressed in a sense, maybe to fit that kind of alto tenor bass sense of the choirs at the time. But what I've done is I've taken kind of sets. So the Craquillon will open, and then we're going to shift to a couple secular pieces to give a little sonic relief, kind of like we're talking about how cold Honey and I are right now in Michigan and New York. And it's just that idea of like how satisfying it is to step into Miami off the plane when you've been so freezing cold. It's so wonderful. But if you're in Miami all the time, you just are, you kind of forget how amazing it is. And so it's just allowing the ear to have a little moment of relief, so that when we dive back into the thickness of the polyphony, we feel again how beautiful it is. So we'll kind of put little secular pieces in there to give the audience a break sonically and to allow them to hear a different texture. So one of those is going to be the Mille Regrets of Josquin, which was apparently a favorite of Charles V. A piece that he loved, and we'll have a quartet sing that, and then we're going to just jump over and do a little Italian, El Grillo, which is a kind of a frotola of Josquin's, but just silly and fun, and just allows us to have a moment of relief, and then we dive back into something like the Ego Flos Campi of Clemens non Papa, which is another big, thick, kind of seamless cadential style piece. So those are the kinds of considerations I rather than just laying out the entire Craquillon mass all at once, I thought, let's give little moments of repose, especially for the singers, because I've sung some of this music myself, and I know kind of what helps me to stay at at the top level of my voice and my mind as I'm going through all of this polyphony.
Right. And I think, sometimes on a concert program, and before I have about two more questions for our amazing panel, and then I would like to pose some questions that the audience might have. So if you are out there and are interested in some questions, and please go ahead and you can chat them to Seraphic Fire, or just chat them to everyone, and we will get them to Honey and Amanda with the time that we have remaining. I always find it a little odd when people program a Renaissance Mass back to back. And so, because it never was, I don't think this is not performance practice, right, Honey? I mean, like, no one ever performed a mass starting with the Kyrie, moving on to the Gloria, and then the Credo, and then the Agnus Dei. I mean, there was mass in between, and all sorts of daily music and various other music by other composers, probably. Yes, I mean,
Well, yes, the mass would have started with a plain chant introit It then would have had a polyphonic Kyrie and a polyphonic Gloria, because those two movements are next to each other in the Mass. But then it would have gone on to the epistle and a prayer and so on and so forth. And only after a while would it have gotten to the polyphonic credo, so on and so forth. So you're absolutely right. No one in the Renaissance performed Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Agnus. It just didn't happen because the Mass was a liturgical event that had it had the consecration, it had communion, it had all of those things involved in it. So those, in a sense, that plain chant would have been oral palate cleansers, the way that Amanda has programmed secular pieces as oral palate cleansers in the concert.
And this is a good time to ask, do either of you all have, like, what's your sort of Capilla Flamenca jam on this show? This is a question to all of y'all, both of you. What is the if you had one piece to take off this show, what is it? I'll start with you, Amanda.
So one piece that I would want to keep, do you mean, like my favorite?
Yes, your person belongs to you.
Well, I think I had to fight you for this one a little bit, but this is going to be the Josquin Ave Maria. The Ave Maria is in some ways, every time I've sung it or conducted it, it just feels like a perfect piece of music in the way that it's delineated and how the points of imitation, everything about it. It's just one of the most satisfying things on the planet. And so I remember in early conversations, I said, oh, can I please include the Ave Maria of Josquin? And of course, this is a piece Josquin may or may not have been singing as a part of this group, right? I mean, I think Honey can talk a little bit more about that. We think maybe traveled over and was all over the place in these different places. But to me, that's kind of, I've put it last because to me it is like the rock star piece. But I have to say, almost equally, the Créquillon Mass movements are so stunning. And I really didn't know them so intimately before undertaking this programming. So I'm actually very grateful to know them. They're just incredible pieces of music.
What about you, Honey? What sort of what's the desert island piece on this show?
Do I really have to choose just?
I mean, I know this is absolutely sort of like the choosing between your children at this point, but
has brought up a really good point, which is that if we don't know a piece really well, and I don't really know the Créquillon, I know it somewhat, and I like it very much. I'm sure I would know it much better once I had rehearsed it and actually performed it. So maybe that would suddenly bump up. I certainly have to agree with her that, Ave Maria is unbelievable. In terms of short pieces, that Mille Regrets is another melting piece. I'm a LaRue specialist. His Mein Herz was wildly popular for many decades after he wrote it. The program is just going to be one terrific piece after another. So I want a big desert island with a lot of different cabanas on it.
Okay, well, we have a few questions, if you don't mind. Ready for this? These are things we haven't rehearsed, so here we go. We have one question from when you listen to polyphonic music that has so much going on, how do you know what to listen to? Or how would you suggest someone who is not familiar with polyphony, how do you go into this concert and receive this music? Do either of you all have I have my own way, but what, Amanda?
Yeah, I would say what I listen for initially are the points of imitation. So I listen for the starts of each section, and they're usually delineated by text. So you can tell something new is happening based on a new piece of text, especially in a text like the Gloria or something that has a lot of different parts to it. So I listen for how does it start? How is it imitated? And then there's something very interesting in this linear music where there are these cadences, but they're not cadences like we learn in music school today necessarily. They're kind of usually between two voices and then maybe amplified by another. And there's these little, you'll hear dissonances, a resolve, and then sometimes just a moment of unison. And there's these beautiful little moments throughout like that. And those draw my ear. And I try to draw the ensemble to those as well. So that's kind of, I listen to like the starts and then what's the journey? And then where are those little pauses? And you can hear it especially in some where there's high and low set against each other, which I think is helpful, especially like in Ego Flus Campi, all of a sudden a moment of homophony and thinking, why? What is that text in that moment? Because it is always deliberate and exciting to hear.
Honey, do you have any recommendations for people who are listening to this music?
Yeah, it's I just found the sound so glorious that sometimes I just like to sit and let it wash over me because it is just so terrific. I liked Amanda's part about the harmonic tension and release, specifically what much of this music use what we call suspensions, where you have two notes rubbing up right against each other. It's a little bit of tension and then it resolves. I just find that so gorgeous. I also find sometimes it's interesting to try to follow an individual part. The nice thing about Seraphic Fire is it's not so huge. You can look at a singer or a group of singers and listen to them specifically. What are they doing with their part? So there are so many different ways to listen to this, and whatever works for an individual is perfectly fine. Text, of course, is always a really nice clue as to what's happening at a given point, but just the overall sound is just so gorgeous. There's a reason they call the 16th century the golden age of polyphony. It's just this sheer beauty of the sound.
Now, when we think about this music, most of it was actually meant to accompany other things going on. So the focus was typically not on the chorus, which was often behind a screen. I always think of it as like when I'm sitting in a very large, tall-ceilinged building in the afternoon, and you see light coming in from the side, and every once in a while you sort of you see that beam of light, but every once in a while you see something catch the light. It's like a fleck of dust or a little bit of smoke or something that changes. And I always feel that Renaissance sacred music is very much like that when you're listening to it, that you're trying to that it is often better to sort of, as you said, let go and let it wash over you, because it's sort of what it was meant to be. It was supposed to create, it's sort of people have, what is it, spa music. This is a little more sort of elevated version of spa music, written for the kings and queens of the 17th century. Great question from Sarah Davies, and which I know that you said that there was some secular music on it. Is there any chant in this? Are you singing the incipits, or is there any? Will we be able, or is there any anything with Cantus Firmus?
Great question. We will sing the incipit of the Gloria, so we'll do the Kyrie and Gloria back to back, and we'll have but it's brief. It's just the Gloria and Excelsis Deo, and then off we go in the polyphony. There's not a lot of Cantus Firmus. I mean, the melody of the Pierre de la Rue piece was a very popular song that he then, harmonized into 4-part polyphony. But it's not real chant heavy. I would say it's 4 or more parts most of the time.
Okay. So Colin asks, and I think this is a great question, and we can start maybe even talk more about Gomber, but in what ways was the Capilla Flamenca responsible for sharing musical style of the day across geographical boundaries? So did they sing in other languages? Did they sing other composers' works? And you all sort of hinted at this, but let's maybe start out with Honey, and then Amanda can jump in here.
Yeah, they traveled all around Europe. I'm sure that the singers, for the most part, probably had as their first language either Dutch or French, but they spent time in Spain. They spent a lot of time in Italy. They spent some time in German lands. So they probably picked up bits and pieces of other languages. They certainly sang in all these languages, just as singers today typically sing in multiple languages. And they were surely responsible for bringing some of this music to new places that had not heard it before. I'm sure that because so much of their music was cutting edge, the latest stuff, the newest stuff, and they were busy touring. I mean, not touring, but traveling around Europe. And I'm quite certain that they were responsible for spreading a lot of this music very widely across different countries.
Yeah, Amanda, you've chosen a number of different languages for us to sing in, as well as composers who are not members of the Capilla Flamenca, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about what went into that? And
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of my goals in doing this was to, this is a very homogenous time period in a way. So attempting to kind of find sonic variety within that, and even text variety within that, was one of the things I wanted to do, just to sort of help to highlight the very broad land that we were dealing with, the travel all over the place. Every single one of these pieces is either the music of all of these composers is found in the collections, or the composers were members. So every single piece is in some way connected. Like even the beautiful De La Rue piece was in the collection of Margaret of Austria. It was like a favorite, and she had it, and so every piece is related. But it's sort of, an effort in my part, I think, to give us sort of a grounding in something that was squarely Capilla Flamenca with the Créquillon Mass, and then to give us flavors of some of the other things that they might have heard or sung, or at least been aware of, just to sort of get maybe a little bit more of the gamut of the sonic palette of the time.
Here's a question, and I think that some of the philosophy that gets codified in the 17th century as the Renaissance is ending is often a reaction to ecclesial music or ecclesial teachings. And so we think of Martin Luther. But I would imagine that in Spain, underneath the rule of Charles V, who is definitively not part of the Reformation, that this doesn't really, there's not a lot, there's probably things that are going even further the other way. I think about Gomber and his writing of over 100 Magnificats, which is sort of like clearly like let's lean into the cult of Mary. But what other ways? Does the Counter Reformation show up in any of this? Honey?
I would actually say that not in terms of the choir singing Counter-Reformation pieces, but I want to put in a good word for Martin Luther, who is he and Charles V were definitely on totally opposite sides of the whole Reformation Counter-Reformation idea. But Martin Luther was a music-loving person who was a performer himself and possibly a composer. And he does introduce the chorale into worship so that the congregation can participate, which is not true of the Catholic service. But Martin Luther loved Josquin, he loved Leroux, he loved Zenfel. He said, if your choir can perform this music, absolutely keep doing it, because it's just such good music. He was perfectly happy to have people continue to sing Latin Catholic church music because the music was so good, and he just felt music was so powerful. So I think that's Charles's chapel definitely was not out there doing anything Reformation related, but the music that his chapel was performing also did continue. Some of it did continue to be performed in Protestant lands.
We have another question from Don, who said that he once in his college music class was required to sort of put together his own requiem by choosing movements by different composers. And Amanda, you've chosen mass movements and I think this is sort of really exciting by Crequillon, who we don't hear much of, but you probably had a lot of choices. I mean, Josquin alone has some pretty amazing mass movements. If you got the choice to maybe program a few, which of these composers that perhaps our audience is not familiar with, are you performing that you would suggest that people check out even more? Because people will know Josquin, but De La Rue, Crequillon, who else is on this on
Yeah.
this?
Yeah. Well, the Clemens on Papa, of course, Clemens, not the Pope, such an interesting distinction. His Ego Flos Campi is really one of the gems, I think, of this time period. And so digging further into that music, it is just so stunning. And of course, that text itself is sort of a Song of Songs text. But the De La Rue, I think it's endless. And we're only really doing one, but that's a place that I really hope people will dig deeper. And we are doing some pieces by Villert, which his music was found in the collections. Now, he was more of a kind of in Italy and so forth. But that's great music. It's really interesting stuff to kind of dig deep and to check out. But yeah, I think really the Crequillon for me has been the thing that I knew the least about, and it's just surprisingly stunning. So,
Honey, any of these composers who, besides De La Rue, you've written a book. So if you're looking for more information on De La Rue, just Google Honey Meconi and De La Rue. But are there? I mean, I will say that like Gombert is such an underperformed composer, and he wrote so much. There's a piece, a lot of these composers do really amazing things where they take single chant lines and they put it as an anchor in one of the voices and then sort of improvise around it. There's a piece by Gombert that sets 7 different chant lines in polyphony with each other at different speeds. I mean, he was sort of like a trickster in terms of putting things together. Are there other composers on this that are similarly sort of ingenious?
I'm not to that level, I would say. I mean, certainly, once again, Josquin and Leroux are just very, very clever in terms of the way they use strict canon, strict imitation to structure some of their pieces. With both of those, even though there are some very, very famous pieces, there's plenty of stuff that is not really explored, and certainly Leroux more than Josquin. Speaking of requiem masses, his is one of the earliest surviving masses. It's an absolutely incredible, incredible mass. I would also agree Gombert is very much an underperformed, under-recorded composer, largely because his music, his scores are not readily available in modern editions. But pretty much anyone who's on this program, which is, as Amanda has chosen very carefully to show the wide, wide range of music and composers connected with the Capilla Flamenca, any of them, I think, are worth a closer look.
Well, thank you, Honey. I mean, I think that it's an incredible time period. So for everyone who's attending this, we actually have a playlist on the website, which has been shared in the chat, which you can listen to some of the pieces that have been recorded. Some of them we don't have much in terms of options for out there, but you can get a sense of what this incredible musical tradition, which was in large part, made possible by the fact that there was this sort of unbelievable musical ensemble, the sort of the very best all-star ensemble around at the time that performed together every day, and most of the people in it were composers. So I encourage everyone to to maybe check that out. We are at the end of our time. And before we go, I'd like to make sure that everyone knows on this video conversation and listening to this podcast knows that our next Seraphic Fire program, the Capilla Flamenca, will run January 16th through 19th. We have performances in Coral Gables, Boca Raton, Fort Lauderdale, and Naples, Florida. And you can find out more about this by visiting seraphicfire.org. I want to offer a very special thank you to our guests and collaborators tonight, Honey Meconi, and to our guest conductor, Amanda Quist, for such a fascinating conversation this evening. Thank you so much to both of you. Really appreciate this. Has been, I've learned so much tonight. So thank you.
It was a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed hearing what everybody had to say. Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you.
And finally, to everyone in attendance tonight, this is actually the third of 6 online lectures that we'll be hosting. And so if you liked it, we hope that you will invite your friends to the next one. If you didn't, invite your enemies. So invite those people you don't like. We'd love to see you all here next time. Thank you so much. And we really look forward to seeing you at our upcoming show, which is featuring the music of Charles V and Philip II, the Capilla Flamenca. Thank you so much, everyone.